Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're talking about charity. Specifically, the kind of charity Victorians offered their poorest citizens, which looked suspiciously like state-sponsored torture. Forget your cozy image of crinolines and gaslight. This is the Victorian era's festering underbelly. This isn't a heartwarming tale of resilience. It's a stark reminder that for centuries, simply lacking money could condemn you to a life designed to make you wish you were dead. We're stepping into the workhouse, a place built not to alleviate suffering, but to make it so unbearable you'd rather starve on the streets. So before we plunge into the damp, airless reality of it all, hit like and subscribe, but only if you're ready for history's ugly, inconvenient truth. Don't tell me where you're watching from, just tell me if you think you'd last a week inside before breaking. Now dim the lights, brace yourself, and step into history's darkest corners, where the walls are stained with despair and the only warmth comes from the faint hope of release through death. So you're broke, lost your job, maybe your health, maybe both. What do you do in Victorian England? Well, if you were truly desperate, you went to the Union Workhouse. Sounds almost friendly, doesn't it? Like a place they'd unite you with a sandwich and a job application. Yeah, no. The real architect of this system was the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. Its brilliant humanitarian philosophy was simple. Make help so goddamn awful, no one would dare ask for it unless they were literally dying. This wasn't social welfare. It was social Darwinism with extra steps and mandatory gruel. The principle was less eligibility, meaning the life of the poorest person inside the workhouse had to be deliberately worse than the life of the poorest laborer outside. Because obviously, the unemployed were just lazy villains having too much fun, right? Your poverty wasn't seen as bad luck or systemic failure. It was a personal moral defect. You were idle, feckless, probably drunkard. Therefore, you didn't deserve comfort. You deserved punishment disguised as aid. Stepping through those heavy oak doors wasn't seeking refuge. It was admitting your failure to Victorian society, and they were ready to make you pay for it. The air inside often hung heavy with the smell of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant trying to mask the stench of despair. You could hear the echoing clang of iron gates and the shuffle of worn boots on stone floors, sounds that pressed down on you heavier than any physical weight. The workhouse wasn't a home, it was a deterrent. Its purpose was to scare the working class straight, to terrify them into taking any job, no matter how brutal or low-paying, just to avoid ending up inside. Think your current job is soul-crushing. At least they probably don't separate you from your spouse and kids, shave your head, and feed you slop for complaining. You thought charity was about kindness. Bless your naive heart. It was about control, judgment, and ensuring the poor knew their place was at the very bottom, looking up in terror at the system designed to keep them there. And if you dared complain about the food, the rules, or the fact that your family was now scattered across different gender-segregated blocks, well, there were always harsher punishments waiting. So you made it. You swallowed your pride, maybe dragged your children behind you and knocked on the door. This wasn't the cozy village poorhouse of yesteryear, where the parish might grudgingly toss you a loaf of bread. This was the future, baby, and it arrived in the form of massive, forbidding brick buildings that looked less like a refuge and more like a prison designed by someone who hated poor people personally. The first thing they did, strip you down. Literally, your own clothes, the last tattered scraps of your former life, were taken, disinfected, maybe, and stored. You were issued the workhouse uniform coarse, ill-fitting, and marked with the workhouse's symbol. Think gray, scratchy, and designed to instantly label you as a pauper, visible to everyone, including yourself. The feel of that rough fabric against your skin was the first physical lesson in your new status: worthless. Then came the true gut punch. If you arrived with your family, your spouse, your kids, maybe an elderly parent, prepare for the severance. The workhouse wasn't about keeping families together. It was about efficiency and preventing the moral contamination of the sexes mingling. The rules were absolute. Men went one way, women another, and children into their own block. Imagine the sound, not just crying, but the raw, visceral wails of parents being physically dragged away from their terrified kids, the desperate scrabbling of small hands trying to hold on. You thought the journey here was hard. That was just the trailer. This wasn't a temporary measure. This was your life now. Husbands might catch a fleeting, distant glimpse of their wives across the exercise yard if they were lucky. Children might go months, or even years, without seeing their parents, raised instead in the sterile, harsh environment of the children's ward by equally stern staff. One report from the time described the unnatural separation of man and wife as a deliberate feature intended to make the workhouse repulsive. Mission accomplished. Remember that phrase, absence makes the heart grow fonder. In the workhouse, absence just made the heart ache until it was numb and made your children forget what your face looked like. Your family became ghosts, glimpsed across a chasm of institutional regulations and locked doors. Your bed was a narrow cot in a long dormitory, filled with the snores, coughs, and stifled sobs of strangers who were now your closest companions. Privacy was a bourgeois fantasy you left outside the gate. You weren't just poor anymore, you were an inmate. And your first lesson wasn't about hard work or self-improvement. It was about loss, isolation, and the crushing, systematic erasure of your identity and your most fundamental human bonds. You've just been initiated into the grand experiment of breaking the human spirit, one shattered family at a time. Now that you're nicely separated and wearing your fashionable pauper gray, it's time to learn the other defining feature of workhouse life. The silence, the routine, and the methodical extinguishing of anything resembling individual thought or connection. Now that they've stripped you of your clothes, your family, and your dignity, it's time to strip you of your thoughts. The workhouse ran on silence and rigid routine, designed to break you down and rebuild you as a perfectly compliant, empty vessel. Any semblance of your former life, your personality, or even casual conversation was strictly forbidden. Did they want you to reflect on your sins of poverty? No, they just wanted you quiet so they could count you easier and ensure you weren't plotting something audacious, like asking for seconds. Your day was dictated by the bell. Woken before dawn, a quick wash in cold water, roll call to make sure no one had conveniently died overnight, or worse, escaped, then straight to the chapel for compulsory prayers. This was followed by breakfast, a thin, watery gruel, more on that joyous topic, shortly eaten in silence naturally. Even eye contact was discouraged. You came here for help and found yourself in a place where the greatest sin wasn't stealing, but speaking without permission or looking out a window. Then came the work, not productive labor designed to teach you a skill, mind you. That would violate the less eligibility rule and risk making you self-sufficient. The work was often deliberately pointless, monotonous, and backbreaking. Men might spend hours breaking rocks or crushing bones for fertilizer. Women picked oakum, separating strands from old rope, a tedious, repetitive task that left fingers raw and minds numb. This wasn't employment. It was punishment masquerading as therapy. The poor law commissioners, in their infinite wisdom, codified these indignities. The Consolidated General Order of 1847 laid down the law on everything from diet to discipline, standardizing the misery across the country. It mandated the separation, the silence during meals, and the superintendent power of the master and matron, who ruled their grim little kingdoms with absolute authority. Every movement was watched, every whisper potentially reported. Worried about your boss tracking your Slack messages? Try living somewhere your every sigh could earn you a night in the refractory cell on bread and water. Idle hands are the devil's playthings, they said. So they made sure your hands were busy with pointless, mind-numbing tasks, effectively making the devil the workhouse master and the inmates his utterly exhausted, despairing congregation. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, filled with the sounds they couldn't suppress, a racking cough from the infirmary, the distant clang of metal, the persistent, low hum of institutional despair that seeped into the very stones. The rough wool of the uniform scratched your skin, the damp chill of the corridors seemed to settle in your bones, and the sheer, unending monotony felt like a physical weight crushing your skull. You were nobody with nothing to say, nothing to do but what you were told. And after a few weeks of this, you started to believe it. Your individuality was a luxury you couldn't afford, stripped away piece by painful piece. And if you were hoping this relentless schedule was at least fueled by something remotely edible, well, you're about to be sorely disappointed. All right, you're dressed like a prison inmate, separated from your kids, and have learned to communicate solely through mournful sighs. Now about dinner or breakfast or lunch. It was pretty much all the same bland, repetitive horror designed not to nourish, but to subdue. Welcome to the workhouse dining hall where your taste buds came to die. The staple, the absolute king of workhouse cuisine, was gruel. Think watery porridge, maybe made from oats or maize, served lukewarm. It was thin, tasteless, and somehow managed to feel both utterly unsatisfying and vaguely sickening at the same time. It was served in metal bowls with metal spoons that scraped annoyingly, and often tasted faintly of iron or something worse. Bread was the other constant companion. Often stale, sometimes moldy, served in specific, meager ounces mandated by the poor law commissioner's dietaries. These official schedules specified exactly what you could eat, on which day, right down to the ounces of cheese or bits of meat, if you were lucky, or old/infirm you might receive. The diet was calibrated to be just enough to prevent outright starvation in healthy adults, but completely insufficient for children, the elderly, or anyone expected to do heavy labor. Did this food give you energy for a day of breaking rocks or picking oakum? Did it satisfy a single craving, chase away a single hunger pang, offer a single moment of simple pleasure? Don't be ridiculous. Its purpose was fuel, like coal shoveled into a grate, except the coal probably had more nutritional variety. One common diet specified gruel for breakfast and supper, and bread, potatoes, and maybe a tiny bit of cheese or meat for dinner. Luxury, the smell of the dining hall was a permanent feature, a nauseating blend of stale bread, watery cabbage soup on soup days, and the general odor of damp, unwashed poverty. Eating was a silent, grim affair, observed by the officers. Any attempt to share food, hoard scraps, or complain about the quality could result in immediate punishment, like being sent to the refractory ward on a diet of bread and water. So you ate the gruel, you ate the bread, and you learned to chew disappointment. Your calorie intake was likely less than half of what a modern, moderately active adult needs. A man doing hard labor might get slightly more bread, but still not enough to sustain him. It was a slow, grinding process of malnutrition designed to wear you down physically and mentally, leaving you with just enough strength to perform your pointless tasks before collapsing back into your narrow cot. It was a diet engineered for misery, ensuring you never forgot you were a burden, kept alive on the absolute minimum required to extract your labor. Now that your stomach is churning just thinking about the food, prepare yourself. Because that meager, disgusting fare was supposed to power you through hours of mind-numbingly pointless, soul-crushing labor. Hope you weren't expecting to build anything useful. All right, your stomach's empty and your family's gone. Time to earn that watery gruel. Forget learning a trade or doing anything remotely useful. The labor in the workhouse wasn't designed to rehabilitate you. It was designed to punish you and make sure you were always worse off than the bloke struggling outside. It was based on the principle of task work, often meaningless toil calibrated to fill your day with exhaustion and zero sense of accomplishment. For the men, this often meant breaking rocks. Hour after hour, day after day, you'd sit with a hammer, smashing large stones into smaller ones, creating piles of rubble that served no purpose other than proving you were capable of physical effort. The sound of hammers on stone was constant, a relentless rhythm of despair echoing through the yard. Dust coated everything, clinging to your sweat-soaked clothes and caking in your throat, a perpetual reminder that your existence had been reduced to manufacturing grit. The women weren't spared the monotony. Their classic task was picking oakum. You'd be given old, tarred ropes, thick and stiff, and told to separate the fibers. Your fingers would become raw, blistered, and often bleeding. The tar got under your nails and stained your skin, a grime you could never wash away. It was a silent, grueling process, each fiber pulled apart a tiny act of suffering, adding to a pile that seemed to grow infinitesimally slowly. Some workhouses had even more sadistic inventions, like the crank machine or the treadmill. The crank was a handle you simply turned, connected to nothing but a device that registered how many rotations you completed. You literally powered thin air for 10 hours a day. The treadmill wasn't for exercise. It was a massive wheel you walked on like a human hamster, often for hours straight, powering. Nothing in particular, except the administration's smug satisfaction at your visible effort. Sir George Nishials, a key figure in the Poor Law reform, saw this hard labor as essential for deterring the able-bodied pauper. Mission accomplished, Nishials. Your muscles would ache constantly, your hands would be raw, and your mind would drift into a numb stupor trying to escape the sheer, unending pointlessness of it all. This wasn't work that built character. It was work that broke bodies and spirits. You were a human engine, powering a machine of deterrence, your output measured only in exhaustion and despair. What did you get for all this monumental, soul-draining effort? The same miserable gruel, the same scratchy uniform, the same hard cot. You weren't paid, you weren't thanked, and you certainly weren't taught a skill that would ever help you leave. Your hard labor paid off, all right. It paid off for the ratepayers who didn't have to support you in any meaningful way, and for the workhouse masters who kept you docile and occupied. Now that you've experienced the joy of manufacturing despair, it's time to see what happens when your body finally gives out under the strain, fueled by gruel and broken dreams. Okay, you've broken rocks, picked oakum, and chewed on disappointment for breakfast. Your body is aching, your fingers are raw, and you probably smell faintly of tar and regret. What happens when your system, weakened by gruel and exhaustion, finally rebels? You end up in the workhouse infirmary, which was less a place of healing and more a waiting room for the graveyard. Sickness wasn't an exception in the workhouse. It was a permanent resident. Packed dormitories, poor sanitation, and that stunning diet of nutritional deficiency were a perfect breeding ground for everything from consumption, tuberculosis, to typhus and smallpox. You could walk in healthy and quickly catch your death from the person coughing on the cot next to you. The infirmary wards were often overcrowded, beds crammed together with barely room for a nurse, if you were lucky enough to have one who wasn't untrained or drunk to squeeze between them. The air was thick with the smell of sickness, stale sweat, unwashed linens, and the cloying, sweet scent of infection. Medical care was rudimentary, to say the least. Workhouse doctors were often overworked, underpaid, and dealing with a tidal wave of complex illnesses fueled by the very conditions they were supposed to be treating. They had limited medicine and even less time. For many workhouse residents, the infirmary was simply where you were sent when you were too weak to work, to await the inevitable end, ensuring you weren't cluttering up the labor yards or dormitories while you died. Remember that phrase, rest in peace. In the workhouse infirmary, finding peace meant finding death. The mortality rates in workhouse infirmaries were often shockingly high compared to the general population, especially during outbreaks. An 1867 report on London workhouse infirmaries by the Lancet Medical Journal exposed horrifying conditions: lack of basic hygiene, insufficient staff, and patients left neglected. This wasn't just neglect. It was, for many, a death sentence served on a hard cot. You might have survived the hunger and the labor, but could you survive the institutionalized indifference to your dying body? Spoiler, probably not. Lying there, you'd feel the clammy dampness of the thin mattress beneath you, hear the weak moans and rattling breaths of your fellow inmates, and watch the dim light filter through grimy windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Every cough, every groan was a chilling reminder that your time might be coming soon. The workhouse didn't just strip you of your life. It often stripped you of a dignified death, leaving you to fade away in a room full of strangers, your body just another problem for the master to log in his ledger. You thought you hit rock bottom when you entered the gate. No, rock bottom was catching a fever in the infirmary, knowing your family wasn't there, and realizing the system designed to help, you had merely curated a more efficient way for you to cease being a burden. And if you were hoping the children were spared these particular horrors, oh, you sweet summer child. Okay, so your body is failing, and you're lying in the infirmary, contemplating the sweet release of death. But spare a thought for the kids, because in the workhouse, childhood wasn't a time of innocence or play. It was just an earlier start to the same cycle of misery. Children, ripped from their parents' arms, were placed in their own blocks, little automatons in training. These weren't nurseries. They were barracks designed to suppress any spark of childish joy or individuality. They wore the same gray uniforms, ate the same dreadful gruel, often even less nutritious, and were subjected to the same rigid routine and silence. The commissioners' rules dictated their lives just as strictly as the adults. One horrifying aspect was the deliberate lack of affection. Physical comfort or emotional support was seen as coddling, something paupers didn't deserve. Think your school teacher was cold. Try one whose job description basically involved ensuring you felt utterly alone. Education was provided, yes, but it was focused on instilling obedience, religious instruction, and just enough reading, writing, and arithmetic to make them useful as cheap labor. Girls learned sewing and domestic skills. Boys learned trades like shoemaking or tailoring, but always within the workhouse walls, limiting their skills and their horizons. There were reports of children being kept in conditions so poor, with so little stimulation, they were described as half-witted or mentally vacant. It's like a slow-motion lobotomy funded by your taxes. The goal wasn't to prepare them for a better life. It was to prepare them for a life of compliant, low-wage labor grateful for scraps. Once they reached a certain age, often as young as 9 or 10, they were apprenticed out. This sounds positive, like learning a valuable skill, right? More often, it was a thinly veiled form of forced servitude, sending workhouse children to farms, factories, or households where they were frequently overworked, abused, and barely fed, exchanging one form of institutional control for another, often worse. Historical reports detail the tragic outcomes. The mortality rate for workhouse children, especially infants, was appallingly high, often double or triple that outside the workhouse walls. They died from neglect, disease, and the sheer brutality of their environment. The silence in the children's dormitories wasn't always due to obedience. Sometimes it was because the children were simply too weak, too broken, or too few. The only toy many of them knew was their own numb fingers or the gray wool of their uniform. You thought maybe the Victorians drew a line somewhere, that perhaps the brutal system softened for the most vulnerable. Of course not. Childhood was simply another phase to be managed, controlled, and extinguished, ensuring the cycle of poverty wasn't broken, merely perpetuated with a new generation of silent, scarred souls. Your own difficult childhood seems practically idyllic by comparison, doesn't it? So now you know what happened to the smallest inmates. But the system had particular cruelties reserved just for the women, beyond separating them from their children. Prepare yourself, it gets worse. All right, you've seen what happens to the kids ripped away and turned into tiny cogs in the machine. Now, let's talk about the women, because the workhouse had a special blend of horrors reserved just for them, mixed with a heavy dose of moral judgment. Poverty was a crime, yes, but for women, any perceived moral failing made you doubly guilty, triply condemned. If you were an unmarried mother, you were seen as particularly reprehensible. The workhouse wasn't just shelter. It was supposed to be a place of moral correction. You weren't just poor, you were fallen, and the system was designed to make you regret every life choice that led you to this point, especially the biological ones. The poor law aimed to discourage illegitimacy, and workhouses became punitive spaces for women who dared to give birth outside of marriage. Your shame was part of the punishment, a scarlet letter stitched onto your gray uniform. Giving birth inside the workhouse was a grim affair. You'd be moved to a small room, often stark and cold, with minimal medical attention. The air would be thick with the smell of carbolic acid and fear. There were few comforts, and the emotional support, non-existent. Your cries of labor were just another noise in the institutional cacophony. And the baby, once born, was immediately a new problem for the system, often destined for the same children's block you were forcibly separated from. The work assigned to women was equally backbreaking and monotonous, endless scrubbing of floors and walls, laundry done by hand in huge, steaming vats using harsh lye soap that burned the skin, and of course, the ubiquitous oakum picking. The smell of damp wool and harsh cleaning chemicals was ever present, clinging to your clothes and your skin. You were expected to labor right up until childbirth and return to it as soon as physically possible. No maternity leave here, just more workhouse efficiency. Women were also particularly vulnerable to the authority of the male staff, the master, and other officers. While the official rules forbade improper conduct, the power imbalance was absolute, and allegations of abuse, though suppressed, were not uncommon. Your body, your life, your choices, they were all under the strict control of the institution. Feeling powerless at your annual performance review, imagine your entire existence dictated by a stern man holding the keys to the only shelter available. You came seeking refuge from the streets, and found yourself trapped in a system that judged your past, controlled your present, and offered little hope for your future, especially if you had a child to care for, or more accurately, to be separated from. The workhouse wasn't a safety net for women. It was a cage designed to punish your poverty and police your morality, ensuring you understood that your body and its functions were public concerns when you were poor. So you've seen how they treated the mothers and how they raised the children. What about those who were just too old, too frail, or too broken to ever contribute to their precious labor quotas again? The workhouse had a plan for them too, naturally. Okay, you've seen the able-bodied broken by labor, the children robbed of innocence, and the women shamed and separated. Now, let's turn to the final category of the workhouse inmate. The aged, the infirm, the genuinely unable to work, the ones who couldn't even pretend to break rocks anymore. If you thought they'd get a little softness, a touch of Dickensian sympathy because they were old or sick, you clearly haven't been paying attention. These were the people who entered the workhouse because they had absolutely nowhere else to go. Their families were gone, dead, or too poor themselves to provide care. They were simply worn out by a lifetime of brutal labor and poverty. The workhouse was their last resort, and for many, it became their final destination. They were often housed in separate wards, euphemistically called the infirmary or aged ward, but it was less a place of care and more a holding pen for those awaiting their end. Conditions in these wards were often appalling. Overcrowding was common, the air thick with the smells of sickness, age, and neglect, stale urine, disinfectant, and the sickly sweet odor of decaying flesh. Beds were hard, often infested with vermin, and privacy was non-existent. You'd lie there, listening to the hacking coughs, the weak moans, and the eerie silence of those who had simply given up. Medical care, as previously noted, was minimal. For the elderly, it was often just managing symptoms and waiting. Basic needs might be met grudgingly, but comfort, dignity, or genuine compassion, those were luxuries the workhouse system simply didn't budget for. An 1890 report found that over 30% of workhouse inmates were aged over 60, and many suffered from multiple chronic conditions. Think of it, almost a third of the population were literally just waiting to die, kept alive on thin gruel and thinner hope. You might get a slightly better diet than the able-bodied, maybe a bit more broth or a tiny piece of meat on Sundays, but it was still inadequate for restoring health or strength. The sensory world of the aged inmate was one of constant, low-level discomfort. The persistent ache in your bones, the cold creeping up from the floor, the blurred vision that made the grim surroundings even more indistinct, the rough touch of the blanket against your thinning skin. They were the living proof of the system's failure. People who had worked hard their whole lives, paid taxes indirectly, through consuming taxed goods, and were now discarded when they were no longer useful. The Victorian ideal of the deserving poor didn't really extend to those whose only crime was outliving their ability to contribute. You thought retirement was about relaxation. In the workhouse, it was just permission to decline faster. They weren't seen as individuals with histories or families. They were just numbers in a ledger, a drain on resources waiting to be cleared. For the aged and infirm, the workhouse wasn't a temporary setback. It was the end of the line. There was no possibility of getting back on your feet or finding work. It was a slow, public fading away, under the indifferent gaze of the institution, surrounded by strangers whose only shared trait was that they too had nowhere else to go. You arrived seeking shelter in your final years and found yourself warehoused, waiting for the ultimate release. Now that you've seen how the workhouse slowly broke everyone who entered it, regardless of age or ability, you might be wondering, could anyone ever leave this place? And if so, what did that freedom actually look like? Spoiler alert, it wasn't a happy ending. All right, you've seen how they broke you down, starved you, and separated you from everyone you loved. Surely the escape route, the moment you walked out those gates, was a moment of triumph, right? A glorious return to freedom. Oh, you poor, optimistic fool. Leaving the workhouse was often less an escape and more a temporary transfer between different circles of hell. You couldn't just peace out whenever you felt like it. The workhouse master had significant control over discharges, particularly for the able-bodied. The goal was deterrence and control, not convenience. Leaving was often restricted to specific days of the week, usually after you'd given notice and completed your final, pointless tasks. The gate didn't just swing open. It was opened by an officer, reminding you that your movement was still dictated by their authority. You'd feel the cold metal of the gate as you passed through, a final physical reminder of the cage you were leaving, and likely returning to. Why leave it all if the outside was so bad? Desperation, mostly. The workhouse was soul-crushing. The risk of starving outside sometimes felt preferable to another day of gruel and silence. Seasonal work, like harvest time or hop picking, offered a brief, brutal opportunity for wages, drawing people out. They'd gamble on making enough to survive a few months, knowing full well that winter, illness, or bad luck would likely send them crawling back. And what did they give you when you left? Not a severance package or a job placement service. Maybe they'd give you back the rags you arrived in, hopefully disinfected. Often you left in the workhouse uniform if your old clothes were too far gone, instantly advertising your status to the world outside. You'd step onto the street with no money, no contacts, and the same crushing poverty that forced you inside in the first place. It was like being ejected from a terrible roller coaster right back to the queue, except the next ride promised the same nausea and no upward climb. The result was a revolving door of human misery. Records show high rates of readmission. People would leave, fail to find work or stability, and be back within weeks or months, defeated. A study of paupers in the 1860s showed that many entered and exited the workhouse multiple times throughout their lives, caught in a cycle they couldn't break. You thought your gym membership was hard to quit. Try escaping a system designed to make failure your only option. The outside world offered freedom, yes, but freedom to starve, freedom to freeze, freedom to be just as invisible and unwanted as you were inside. The air outside might smell fresher, free from the pervasive workhouse stench, but the sight of familiar streets just highlighted how little had changed, except you were now perhaps weaker, more demoralized, and more visibly marked by the system. Your footsteps on the pavement sounded different, hopeful, perhaps, for the first hour, then increasingly heavy with the dawning realization that outside wasn't a solution, just the slightly larger, colder version of the same prison. So you leave back into the indifferent world that judged you for being poor in the first place. The only real escape the workhouse offered was death. But even in this bleakest of landscapes, a flicker of defiance, a tiny spark of humanity, sometimes managed to ignite. Okay, you've accepted your fate, your gruel, and your pointless task. The system is designed to crush you, to make you utterly compliant. But even in this controlled environment, human nature occasionally rebels, even if just a little bit. Workhouse inmates weren't robots. They were desperate, angry people, and sometimes that desperation boiled over. Small acts of defiance were constant background noise. Muttering under your breath about the food, secretly sharing a scrap of bread, taking a slightly longer break during oakum picking. These were tiny, risky rebellions that could earn you a harsh reprimand or a loss of privileges. What privileges, you ask? Good question. The masters and matrons knew these occurred and were constantly on guard, their eyes scanning the dormitories and work yards for any sign of insubordination. The air itself felt watchful, thick with unspoken tensions. Sometimes the defiance escalated. Refusing to work was a capital offense in the workhouse economy. It could land you in the refractory ward, a bare, often unheated cell, sometimes with chains on the wall, where you'd be confined on a diet of bread and water for days. The smell of stale air, fear, and perhaps old vomit would greet you. You'd sit in the dim light, maybe hearing the distant sounds of the workhouse routine continuing without you, a chilling reminder of your isolation. Article 58 of the Consolidated General Order specifically outlined punishments for refractory paupers, including solitary confinement and reduced diet. Larger disturbances, though rare, did happen. Workhouse riots occurred periodically, often sparked by changes to the diet, making it even worse, unbelievably, harsh treatment by officers or sheer desperation. In 1842, the Andover workhouse scandal revealed not only starvation diets, but also inmates so desperate they were found eating the rotten flesh off bones they were supposed to be crushing for fertilizer. When this came out, there was public outcry and investigations, but the fundamental system remained. You were literally chewing on death to survive, and complaining about that was still grounds for punishment. Feeling exploited at your office pizza party, at least the pepperoni wasn't human. Escape attempts were another form of defiance, usually short-lived and brutally suppressed. Scaling walls, sneaking through poorly secured areas, these were desperate gambles with terrible odds. If caught, the punishment was severe, often involving magistrates and imprisonment in a real jail, which, unbelievably, was sometimes preferred over the workhouse. Think about that, a Victorian prison could be seen as an upgrade. These acts of rebellion, from a muttered curse to a desperate scramble over a wall, were fleeting sparks against the overwhelming darkness. They rarely changed the system, but they served as a bitter testament to the human spirit's refusal to be completely extinguished, even when trapped in a place designed for that very purpose. You might break the body, but sometimes, just sometimes, the will flickered on. But for most, that flicker was quickly snuffed out, either by punishment or by the slow, inexorable process of decline. And when that happened, there was one final, anonymous indignity waiting. All right, you've navigated the gruel, the oakum, the separation, and maybe even managed a tiny, futile act of rebellion. But the workhouse held one final, undeniable victory over you: death. And in Victorian England, even your death belonged to the state when you were poor. If you died in the workhouse infirmary, or even just in the general ward because you were too old or sick to move, your body became the workhouse's property. Your family, if they even knew you were there or were still alive themselves, might not be informed or able to claim you. The system that controlled your life maintained its grip in death. The smell of death mingled with the usual workhouse odors, a coppery, decaying sweetness that no amount of disinfectant could mask. Forget elaborate funerals or weeping relatives. You were a pauper, a burden removed. Your burial was handled efficiently, cheaply, and with maximum anonymity. According to the Anatomy Act of 1832, yes, they had an act for this, unclaimed bodies from workhouses were primary targets for medical dissection. If your body wasn't claimed by relatives within a strict time frame, who, remember, might not even know you were dead or have the means to claim you, you could legally end up on a dissecting table. Think your last job treated you like a disposable organ? At least they didn't literally turn you into one for science. If you avoided the dissection table, your final resting place was the pauper's grave. Not an individual plot with a headstone bearing your name, but a mass grave, an unmarked pit dug to receive multiple bodies at once. Often, the only marker was a numbered stake, if anything, corresponding to a grim ledger back at the workhouse that recorded who was buried where in the trench. You'd feel the cold, damp earth pressed around you, indistinguishable from the strangers on either side. The sound of the shovels filling the pit was the only eulogy you received, a rhythmic thud of dirt on wood, burying not just your body, but your name, your story, your existence. These were the unconsecrated grounds, the potter's fields, often on the edge of cemeteries or in separate plots, places respectable society avoided. You were literally buried outside the boundaries of polite memory. Your life was erased by the workhouse. Your death was just the final administrative step. You entered anonymous, you lived anonymous, and you were buried anonymous. They say you can't take it with you when you die. In the workhouse, you didn't even get to keep your own body or your name. Your legacy was a number in a ledger and a forgotten spot in a field, shared with countless others who had suffered the same fate. It was the ultimate expression of the workhouse philosophy. You were nothing, and in death you became less than that. So there you lie, one of the forgotten. But while the individual bodies were buried and the pits covered, the shadow of the workhouse system didn't just disappear into the ground. Its legacy lingers, shaping the way society still views poverty even today. All right, you're 6 feet under in an unmarked pit, hopefully having avoided the dissection table. But don't get too comfortable in your anonymous dirt nap, because the ideas that built the workhouse didn't die with you. The physical buildings might have been repurposed, the laws eventually changed, but the spirit of the workhouse, that judgment-laden stench of poverty as a crime, still hangs around like a bad smell on a damp, gray day. Many of those imposing brick fortresses didn't get torn down. Too expensive, you see. Some were transformed, ironically, into hospitals, mental asylums, or later, elderly care homes. The very walls that imprisoned the poor and sick became places where the sick and elderly were housed, sometimes retaining the same long corridors, the same drafty wards, the same faint, institutional smell that hinted at their grim origins. You might walk into an old hospital building today and get an unsettling feeling you can't quite place. Yeah, that might be the residual despair soaking into the masonry. While the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 was finally abolished by the National Assistance Act of 1948, officially ending the workhouse system, the core philosophy didn't vanish. The idea that poverty is largely your own fault, a sign of laziness or poor choices, persisted. The principle of less eligibility didn't just disappear, it merely put on a nicer suit and changed its name to things like means testing, welfare conditionality, and ensuring that receiving state aid feels about as pleasant and dignified as picking oakum with your teeth. You thought you were free of Victorian judgment? Look around. The public discourse about welfare recipients, the hoops people have to jump through to get help, the constant scrutiny, it all echoes the workhouse era's deep suspicion of the poor. The system still often operates on the assumption that you're probably trying to cheat it, that you don't really need help, and that any assistance should be grudging, minimal, and preferably slightly uncomfortable. It's the ghost of the workhouse master peering over your shoulder as you fill out forms. The sensory echoes are there if you look for them. The cold, hard benches in waiting rooms for public services. The confusing, dehumanizing bureaucracy that makes you feel like a number, not a person. The subtle but pervasive societal message that if you're struggling, it's because you haven't worked hard enough, haven't made the right choices. It's the distant clang of those iron gates, not in your ears, but in the back of your mind, a reminder of what happens when society decides you're a burden. The workhouse was built on the brutal truth that a society's tolerance for suffering often depends on who is doing the suffering. And while we don't have literal oakum-picking yards anymore, the systems designed to manage poverty still carry the DNA of that Victorian cruelty. We've just made it slightly more palatable, slightly more bureaucratic, slightly more polite. So you survived the Victorian workhouse, or maybe you didn't. Either way, the principles that built it didn't just die. They mutated, adapted, and stuck around. And that, my friends, is the truly horrifying part. So you've walked the halls, picked the oakum, and tasted the gruel. You've seen families shattered and the elderly discarded. The Victorian workhouse wasn't just a building. It was a machine for crushing human spirit, designed with a chilling efficiency that makes your blood run cold. It was the ultimate expression of a society that saw poverty not as a problem to be solved, but a sin to be punished. You might think we've moved past that. You might look at modern welfare systems and tell yourself we're kinder now, more compassionate. Are we, or have we just gotten better at disguising the judgment? We don't have Occam picking yards, no, but we have benefit sanctions, complex bureaucracy designed to trip you up, and a constant public narrative that questions the deserving nature of anyone who needs help. The workhouse taught that help must be deliberately worse than the struggle. That principle didn't vanish, it just got an upgrade. The idea that your poverty is your personal failing, that assistance should feel uncomfortable, that you should be grateful for the bare minimum, that's the ghost of the workhouse, rattling its chains in the algorithms and the headlines of today. We closed the gates, but we didn't bury the philosophy. We just made the walls invisible. Sleep well.